It was a typical day at 35,000 feet, the kind where everything seems calm and routine. But on this particular flight, something happened that would change the entire atmosphere. As the plane cruised through the skies, no one could have predicted the drama unfolding just a few rows away. A well-dressed woman, elegant in every sense, settled into her seat, her confidence radiating. She was used to traveling in style, and it was clear she belonged in the world of luxury. The soft rustling of her designer bag and the gentle click of her heels seemed to set her apart from the rest of the passengers. Everything seemed perfect until it wasn't. A flight attendant, who was busy navigating the aisles, walked by. With a quick glance, she seemed to size up the woman. But what happened next would make anyone's jaw drop. In an instant, a snide remark was thrown her way, dripping with disdain. It wasn't just a casual comment, it was a blatant insult. A remark that, to put it simply, struck at the very heart of the woman's dignity. But as the flight attendant walked off, believing that her harsh words had landed and the woman would just brush it off, little did she know, things were about to take a turn. The elegant woman, her composed demeanor hiding a simmering intensity, stood up slowly, her eyes narrowing as she locked onto the flight attendant. There was a sense of quiet power in her every movement. The whole plane felt like it held its breath, waiting for what would come next. And then, just 2 minutes later, the flight attendant was in shock. What had seemed like a brief moment of tension was quickly escalating, but this time the tables were about to be turned. The woman wasn't just going to sit quietly and let the insult slide. No, she had a response, one that no one would expect. What happened next would completely change the power dynamic between the two. But what exactly did the elegant woman do? How did the situation unfold? You won't believe how the story continues. Stay tuned to find out what happens next, because in just 2 minutes, everything changed. The woman who had been insulted was far from the type to make a scene. In fact, she was known for her grace under pressure, a trait she had carried with her through years of navigating both high society and everyday life. Her name was Naomi, and though she had worked hard for everything she had, she was never the kind to flaunt it. She dressed in a way that was effortlessly stylish, never overdone, but always elegant. The kind of person who radiated self-assurance without needing to shout it from the rooftops. Naomi had boarded the plane that afternoon, looking forward to a peaceful, quiet flight. She had a business trip ahead, and after a hectic week of meetings, she simply wanted to relax and catch up on some much-needed rest. The hum of the airplane, the soft vibration beneath her, and the calm of the sky outside the window were the perfect backdrop for her to unwind. But then came the moment that shattered that peace, just like a pebble disrupting the still surface of a pond. The flight attendant's words had come quickly, almost too quickly. There was no polite greeting, no recognition of Naomi's well-dressed demeanor or the way she exuded quiet class. Instead, the words were sharp, dismissive, as if Naomi didn't belong in the same space as the other passengers. It wasn't even what the flight attendant had said that bothered Naomi the most. It was the tone, the undercurrent of judgment that she could feel without it ever being explicitly said. Naomi's eyes followed the flight attendant as she walked away, her back stiff, her expression unreadable. She knew that the words had been aimed at her, and for a moment she felt a deep sense of injustice, like the air itself had turned colder. But Naomi didn't respond right away. She wasn't the type to make a scene or escalate conflict, and she certainly didn't want to draw attention to herself. Instead, she closed her eyes for a moment, trying to let the insult slide off her like water on a duck's back. But there was something inside her that simply couldn't let go of what had happened. She had faced prejudice before, especially as a black woman navigating spaces that were often unwelcoming or outright hostile. It wasn't the first time someone had underestimated her or judged her unfairly, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But Naomi had learned over the years that the best way to handle these situations was with quiet dignity, never allowing anyone to see how much their words affected her. It was a survival tactic she had perfected over the years, a way to rise above the nonsense and keep her focus on what really mattered. Still, there was something different about the way this flight attendant had approached her. It wasn't just the words, it was the look, the quick up and down glance that seemed to size her up as if she didn't belong. Naomi had encountered that look before, and it stung every time. But today, it was different. Today, Naomi wasn't going to let it go. She wasn't going to sit in silence and allow someone else to make her feel small. Not today. With a quiet resolve, Naomi stood up from her seat, taking a deep breath as she steadied herself. Her pulse quickened slightly, but her face remained calm, composed, as always. She glanced toward the front of the plane, where the flight attendant was busy with another passenger. Naomi could feel the gaze of the other passengers on her, as though they could sense something brewing. The tension in the cabin was palpable. She walked down the aisle with a purposeful grace, her heels clicking on the floor, each step bringing her closer to the source of her frustration. As she approached the flight attendant, she noticed how the woman was laughing and chatting with a nearby passenger, unaware of the storm brewing just behind her. Naomi could have let it go. She could have returned to her seat and ignored it, just like she had so many times before. But today, something had shifted in her, something that wouldn't allow her to simply turn away. The flight attendant finally noticed her as she approached. She gave a polite but distracted smile, clearly not realizing the gravity of what had just transpired. Naomi's voice was calm, but there was a steel edge to it, the kind of calm that comes from someone who knows they're about to speak the truth. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying just enough to be heard clearly. "Could we have a moment to talk?" The flight attendant blinked in surprise, clearly caught off guard. "Oh, of course," she said, her tone shifting slightly, a hint of discomfort creeping in. Naomi didn't give her a chance to backtrack or make excuses. She'd made her decision. "You may not realize this," Naomi continued, her eyes locking onto the flight attendants with a quiet intensity, "but your words earlier were hurtful, and I'd like to understand why you felt the need to say them." The flight attendant's face turned pale, a flush of embarrassment creeping up her neck. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. There was no apology, no quick way to undo the damage. She could feel the weight of Naomi's words pressing down on her, and for the first time, she was no longer in control of the situation. The tables had turned. The passengers nearby had begun to notice the exchange, and the usual hum of conversation died down. All eyes were now on Naomi and the flight attendant, some curious, others uncomfortable. It was clear that the tension in the air was thickening, the entire cabin waiting for what would happen next. Naomi wasn't done. "I'm not looking for an apology, not yet," she said, her voice steady, calm. "But I do want to understand why you thought it was okay to speak to me that way. What made you think it was acceptable?" The flight attendant's eyes darted around, looking for support, but there was no one to back her up. The passengers, once silent onlookers, now seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see how this would play out. Naomi's composed presence had a certain magnetic pull, drawing everyone into the drama unfolding before them. It was clear the flight attendant was struggling to find the right words. She opened her mouth once more, but no sound came out. The power had shifted. Naomi was no longer the passive observer, and the flight attendant realized she was being called out. She was being forced to confront her own behavior, something she had clearly hoped to avoid. And it was in this moment, as the seconds stretched into what felt like eternity, that Naomi knew this confrontation wasn't just about her. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult, even when it meant challenging someone who thought they were in control. The tension in the cabin grew unbearable, and just as it seemed like the flight attendant was about to say something, perhaps an apology or a defense, Naomi did something that no one could have predicted. Naomi stood there, her eyes unwavering as she locked onto the flight attendant, waiting for a response. The air between them seemed to stretch out longer than it should have, each second feeling like an eternity. Around them, the passengers were clearly watching, some out of curiosity, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats, but no one spoke. Everyone was holding their breath, wondering what Naomi would do next. The flight attendant, visibly flustered, glanced around. She had been so used to the authority she carried as a member of the flight crew, often walking the aisles as though nothing could touch her. But this was different. Naomi wasn't backing down, and the flight attendant could feel her control slipping through her fingers. She swallowed hard, trying to regain composure, but the words still weren't coming. Naomi felt a flicker of something, a sense of power she wasn't accustomed to using. But this wasn't about her. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about calling out the subtle, insidious disrespect that so many people in her life had dismissed as just the way things are. She had spent years learning to navigate the world with grace, swallowing her frustrations and letting slights slide off her back, but today felt different. The insult had struck too close to a nerve. Maybe it was the final straw. The flight attendant shifted nervously, clearing her throat, clearly searching for the right words. I didn't mean to offend you," she finally said, her voice shaky. "It was just a mistake. I didn't." "Really?" Naomi interrupted, her voice calm, but her words cutting through the air. "A mistake. A mistake is when you accidentally spill something or forget to offer water to someone. This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice." She leaned in slightly, her presence commanding. "You chose to disrespect me, and now you want to brush it off like it was nothing." The flight attendant's face flushed with embarrassment, but Naomi wasn't done. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This wasn't just about one flight attendant and one insult. It was about everything she had experienced in her life, all the moments when people underestimated her, when they assumed she didn't belong or wasn't good enough. Naomi had spent too long staying silent, letting others walk all over her. But not today. Today, she was going to make her voice heard. "Do you know what it feels like?" Naomi continued, her voice still measured but full of intensity, "to walk into a room and have people look at you like you don't belong. To be judged by the color of your skin or the way you carry yourself, and to have people decide your worth before you even open your mouth." The flight attendant took a step back, caught off guard by the intensity in Naomi's words. She wasn't expecting this. She had thought Naomi would simply back down, that she would let the insult slide like so many others before her. But Naomi wasn't the type of woman to just accept things and move on. She had spent too much of her life holding herself back, pushing down the anger and frustration that bubbled up from time to time. But in this moment, Naomi knew she had to speak out. She had to demand the respect that everyone deserved, even when it wasn't easy. The silence in the cabin deepened, as if everyone on board was holding their collective breath, waiting for the next move. Naomi's words hung in the air, like an unspoken challenge. The flight attendant could feel the weight of it, and now she was no longer just dealing with Naomi. She was standing before a woman who had had enough of being treated as less than. Across the aisle, a few passengers exchanged nervous glances. Some were uncomfortable, unsure of how to react. Others seemed almost relieved that Naomi was taking a stand, her voice echoing what many had felt but never dared to say. One older woman, sitting near the back, looked at Naomi with admiration. She had lived through decades of injustice, seen countless people stay silent when they should have spoken up, and she saw something different in Naomi's eyes: strength, conviction, and the courage to call out what was wrong. But not everyone was on Naomi's side. A man a few rows ahead, who had been watching the confrontation with growing discomfort, muttered under his breath, "This is ridiculous. She's making a scene for nothing." The flight attendant seemed to shrink under Naomi's gaze, her fingers twitching nervously as she fumbled with the edge of her uniform. "I'm sorry," she finally said, though her words lacked conviction. "I didn't mean it like that. I don't know what came over me. I'm sorry." Naomi looked at her, her face unreadable. The apology wasn't enough. It never would be, because this wasn't just about what the flight attendant had said in that moment. It was about a lifetime of subtle, small insults that piled up over time, creating an invisible weight that people like Naomi had to carry every day. She stood still for a moment, her mind racing. Naomi was a woman who had spent so long trying to make her life work, to achieve success in a world that wasn't always welcoming. She had worked harder than most, faced obstacles that others couldn't even imagine, and yet she had learned to keep her composure, to move through life with grace. But now, here in this tiny space between two strangers, she was being forced to confront something bigger than a simple insult. It was a systemic issue, one that affected people like her every single day. The flight attendant's apology was weak, too little, too late. It wasn't the kind of apology that carried any real understanding. Naomi knew that it wasn't enough to just apologize and move on. She needed something more. She needed to see whether this woman, who had made a snap judgment based solely on her appearance, was willing to take responsibility for the deeper issues at play. "I appreciate your apology," Naomi said, her voice cool, "but you need to understand that this goes beyond just words. This isn't a one-time incident. This is about how people like you treat people like me every day, in ways both big and small. And if you think for a second that a simple apology will fix that, then you're missing the point entirely." The flight attendant blinked, her face a mixture of confusion and realization. She opened her mouth to respond, but Naomi held up a hand, silencing her. There was no quick fix to this, no immediate resolution. This wasn't a conversation that could be wrapped up in a few sentences. Naomi was tired of people thinking they could brush off these issues with a few empty words. As the seconds ticked by, Naomi could feel the weight of the moment settling in. She wasn't going to let this flight attendant off the hook, not just for her own sake, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than because of who they were. The tension in the air grew thicker, and for the first time in a long time, Naomi felt truly seen. The fight wasn't over yet, and the resolution, if it ever came, was far from clear. The air in the cabin felt like it was holding its breath, the tension so thick it was almost tangible. Naomi stood tall, her eyes locked onto the flight attendant, who was now visibly uncomfortable, shifting on her feet. The passengers around them were still silent, their eyes flicking back and forth between the two women. It was as if the entire plane had become a stage, and the tension between Naomi and the flight attendant was the drama everyone had been waiting for. The flight attendant, still flushed with embarrassment, opened her mouth several times as if searching for the right words, but nothing came. She couldn't seem to find the strength to fully address what was happening. Naomi had drawn a line in the sand, and now the flight attendant was trapped between the weight of her own guilt and the realization that she wasn't getting out of this with a simple apology. She had underestimated Naomi, thinking that this would be another interaction she could shrug off, but now it was spiraling out of her control. Naomi stood perfectly still, her gaze never wavering. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, some now beginning to whisper among themselves. She wasn't just standing up for herself anymore. She was standing up for everyone who had been made to feel small, dismissed, or invisible because of their race, gender, or appearance. The cabin was alive with whispers and murmurs, but Naomi didn't hear any of it. She was focused on one thing and one thing only: the flight attendant who had disrespected her and now had to face the consequences. After a few moments of silence, the flight attendant looked around, trying to find someone who could intervene. She turned toward the head flight attendant, a woman who had been overseeing the cabin from the front. The head flight attendant had been watching from afar, but now she took a few hesitant steps toward Naomi and the flight attendant, sensing the rising tension. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, her voice soft, almost apologetic. Naomi didn't take her eyes off the flight attendant. "No," she replied simply, her voice clear but laced with a quiet fury. "Everything is not okay." The head flight attendant looked from Naomi to her colleague, her face registering surprise. She must have known something was off, but until now, she had hoped it was just a misunderstanding. Naomi could feel the eyes of the other passengers shift to the head flight attendant, some of them now bracing for what might come next. The air in the cabin was like static, charged with expectation. The flight attendant, who had initially insulted Naomi, shifted awkwardly, her hands nervously tugging at the edge of her uniform. She opened her mouth once more, her words coming out in a rushed stammer. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I didn't mean. Stop, Naomi interrupted, her voice firm, a quiet power radiating from her. Your apology doesn't mean anything if you don't understand why what you said was wrong. She turned to the head flight attendant now, her eyes narrowing. Do you understand why this is a problem? The head flight attendant hesitated, her face softening, but still she said nothing. She looked at Naomi with an unreadable expression, as if weighing her options, as if deciding whether to step in and de-escalate the situation, or whether to let it continue, knowing there was no going back. Naomi's jaw clenched. She wasn't backing down. Not now. Not after everything. It's not just about this one moment, she continued, her voice growing stronger. It's about how people like me are treated every single day. It's about assumptions being made before we even speak, before we even open our mouths. It's about prejudice, whether it's big or small. And you just handed it to me on a silver platter. So don't tell me it was a mistake, because it wasn't. It was a choice, your choice. The flight attendant stood there, now visibly crumbling under the weight of Naomi's words. She looked at the head flight attendant for support, but the woman didn't offer any. Instead, the head flight attendant slowly nodded, her expression shifting from concern to something more serious, something that suggested she too understood the deeper issue at play. Naomi glanced around the cabin, feeling the gaze of the passengers on her. She saw the older woman from the back, who had been watching the exchange closely, now giving Naomi a slight nod of approval. That small gesture was like a spark, igniting something in Naomi. It wasn't just about this flight or this moment. It was about something much larger. She wasn't just confronting a flight attendant anymore. She was challenging the system, the world that had allowed small acts of disrespect to go unchecked for so long. A few passengers shifted in their seats, one murmuring to another, while a couple of others exchanged uncertain glances. No one was speaking out, but Naomi could feel the shift. They were all watching, waiting to see what would happen next. The tension was unbearable. The flight attendant finally spoke again, her voice softer, almost pleading. I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. She trailed off, unable to finish her sentence, the words dying on her lips. The apology was hollow, insincere. Naomi could see that. It was in this moment that Naomi realized something crucial. The flight attendant's apology meant nothing if it didn't come with real understanding. Naomi wasn't just asking for an apology, she was demanding change. She was demanding that people like the flight attendant confront their biases, their assumptions, and acknowledge the harm they caused. But that wasn't something that could be resolved in an hour-long flight. This wasn't a conversation that could end with a simple apology and a handshake. Naomi took a deep breath, her voice steady but filled with an unshakable resolve. This isn't over, she said quietly, but the words rang out with a kind of finality. I'm not going to let you walk away from this and pretend it didn't happen. You will think about this. You will remember this moment, and maybe, just maybe, you'll start to understand that things have to change. The flight attendant didn't respond. She stood there, her shoulders slumped, looking defeated. The head flight attendant stood beside her, silent, but Naomi knew that she was now a part of this too. No one was leaving this encounter without feeling its weight. And just as Naomi turned to walk back to her seat, she felt a shift in the atmosphere, a change she hadn't anticipated. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, as if the resolution to this tense standoff wasn't just in her hands anymore, but in the hands of everyone who had witnessed it. The flight was far from over, and Naomi knew the real battle was just beginning. As Naomi made her way back to her seat, her heart was pounding in her chest. She had said what she needed to say, but she could feel the eyes of everyone on her, like they were all waiting for the next step, for some kind of resolution. She sat down, her hands still trembling slightly as she buckled her seatbelt, her thoughts racing. But the weight of what had just happened wasn't leaving her. It lingered in the air like an unsolved puzzle. And then, just when Naomi thought the situation had reached its peak, the unexpected happened. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, a calm and reassuring tone that almost felt out of place given the tension in the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." It was a routine announcement, one that passengers had heard countless times before, but this time it only added to the unease in the air. The plane jolted slightly, and several passengers gasped. Naomi felt the movement, a sharp reminder that, despite everything, she was still at the mercy of this plane, just as vulnerable as everyone else on board. But just as quickly as it started, the turbulence subsided, and the cabin settled back into an uneasy quiet. However, before Naomi could relax, the flight attendant, who had been the source of the earlier conflict, suddenly reappeared at her aisle. This time, her expression was different, harder, colder. Naomi's stomach tightened. The flight attendant's voice was low but clear as she leaned in, not saying a word, but making sure Naomi was paying attention. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she whispered, her eyes narrowing. Naomi froze. The words hung in the air like a threat, unspoken but clear. What did that mean? What was this flight attendant trying to imply? For a moment, Naomi simply stared at her, trying to process what she had just heard. It felt like the tension in the air had just been ratcheted up another notch, and she couldn't quite understand why. The flight attendant's demeanor had shifted from defensive to something darker, more personal. Before Naomi could respond, the woman straightened up and walked away briskly, heading toward the back of the plane. Naomi's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Was she being threatened? Had she misjudged the situation? Or had this flight attendant really just thrown a warning into the mix, something meant to unsettle her, to make her second-guess her position? The passengers around Naomi seemed to have noticed the strange exchange. Several were whispering again, though no one dared to speak too loudly. Naomi's thoughts were a blur. She knew something wasn't right, but she couldn't put a finger on it. She glanced around the cabin, scanning the faces of the people seated nearby. Some looked curious, others uneasy. A few even seemed to be avoiding her gaze altogether, as if they were afraid of getting caught in the middle of this building storm. The seconds ticked by, but it felt like hours. The unsettling silence that followed was almost more suffocating than the earlier tension. Naomi's eyes kept drifting toward the rear of the plane, where the flight attendant had disappeared. What was she up to now? What did she mean by that cryptic remark? The plane continued to hum steadily through the sky, but Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A sense of dread settled deep in her gut, and she couldn't help but feel that this encounter was far from over. Her hands gripped the armrests tightly as she leaned back in her seat, trying to calm herself. She had stood up for herself, and she had made her point, but now she wasn't sure if she had just opened the door to something much bigger than she could have imagined. Then, in the quiet of the cabin, Naomi heard a faint sound, a soft click that echoed across the aisle. It was barely audible, but it was enough to catch her attention. Her eyes snapped to the source of the noise, and she saw the flight attendant again, now standing in the back of the plane, holding something in her hand. At first it seemed harmless, a small black device, but the look on her face said otherwise. It wasn't a normal part of the in-flight service, and as Naomi's eyes widened in realization, she knew exactly what it was. It was a phone, a burner phone. Naomi's breath caught in her throat. She had no idea who this flight attendant really was, but something in her gut told her that this wasn't just a random incident anymore. The woman had been acting strange from the start, and now Naomi realized that her behavior was more calculated than she had originally thought. The warning, the coldness, the cryptic remark, it all made sense now. This flight attendant was hiding something, and Naomi was about to find herself entangled in something far more dangerous than a simple flight conflict. The flight attendant disappeared into the galley, but Naomi could still feel the weight of what she had just witnessed. A burner phone. Why would she need that? Was this a personal vendetta, Or was she part of something larger? Something far more sinister? Naomi tried to shake off the feeling of dread that washed over her, but it wouldn't leave. She couldn't ignore the possibility that this wasn't just about her and the flight attendant anymore. There were bigger forces at play, forces that could change everything. Naomi's mind raced as she tried to piece together what she had just seen. Her eyes flicked back to the rest of the passengers, who seemed oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath the surface. No one else seemed to have noticed the strange exchange between Naomi and the flight attendant, but Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Her grip on the armrest tightened as the realization hit her. Whatever was going on, she was in deeper than she had ever intended. And now she had to decide, would she confront this threat head-on, or would she let the events unfold around her, unaware of what was coming next? The stakes were higher than ever, and Naomi had no choice but to brace herself for whatever came next. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted again. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Naomi could feel it. The calm was gone, replaced by an undercurrent of tension that seemed to pulse with every passing second. Something was coming, and Naomi wasn't sure she was ready for it. But one thing was certain, this was no longer just about an insult or an apology. The game had changed, and Naomi had unknowingly stepped into the eye of a storm. Naomi's heart raced in her chest as she sat frozen, staring at the back of the plane where the flight attendant had disappeared. The turbulence had died down, but the sense of unease in the cabin had only grown stronger. The more she thought about the strange interaction, the more she realized that this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. Something bigger was at play, something that was slowly starting to unfold around her. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. The quiet hum of the plane was a stark contrast to the storm of thoughts swirling in Naomi's mind. She couldn't shake the image of the flight attendant holding the burner phone, the coldness in her eyes, the cryptic warning that had sent chills down her spine. Naomi had tried to brush it off at first, thinking maybe it was just her paranoia getting the best of her, but now, with each passing second, she felt the pressure building. And then, just as the flight seemed to settle into its rhythm again, something snapped. The air suddenly became tense, the passengers around her shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Naomi's instincts kicked in, and she turned toward the front of the plane, where she saw a shadow moving through the aisle, a figure who seemed to be heading toward the cockpit. It was the flight attendant again, but this time she wasn't alone. Naomi's breath caught in her throat as she saw two more people, a man and a woman, following closely behind her. They were dressed in casual clothing, not uniforms. The man's expression was hard, his jaw clenched tightly, while the woman had an almost calculating look in her eyes, scanning the cabin with cold precision. Naomi felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. This was no coincidence. Something was wrong, and she was about to find out exactly what. As the trio reached the cockpit door, Naomi's thoughts raced. She knew she couldn't just sit there anymore. She had to act. Slowly, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, her movements deliberate and calm despite the chaos inside her. She wasn't sure what she was walking into, but she couldn't let them get away with whatever they were planning. Naomi walked down the aisle, her heart thudding in her chest, trying to blend in with the few passengers who were still unaware of what was unfolding. She kept her eyes trained on the flight attendants and the two strangers as they stood in front of the cockpit door, murmuring among themselves. They had their backs turned, and Naomi seized the moment. She took a deep breath and approached them, her voice low but steady. "What are you doing?" The group turned around in surprise, clearly not expecting anyone to confront them. The man stepped forward, his face tight with tension. "This doesn't concern you," he said, his voice dangerously calm. Naomi didn't flinch. "It does now. I'm not just going to sit here while you..." Before she could finish, the flight attendant who had insulted her earlier stepped forward, cutting her off. "You're not the only one who has a voice on this plane," she said coldly, her eyes narrowing as if Naomi was the last person she wanted to deal with. For a moment, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Naomi realized the gravity of the situation. These weren't just rogue flight attendants, they were part of something far bigger. It was clear now that the burner phone, the strange behavior, and the cryptic warning had all been leading up to this moment. The man gave Naomi a cold smile. "You really don't understand, do you?" he said. "This isn't about you or your little grievance. This is about power, control, and making sure things stay the way they are." Naomi's mind raced. Power, control? What was he talking about? Just as she was about to press for more answers, the woman next to the man spoke up. Her voice was like ice. "You should sit down. There are things happening on this plane that you wouldn't even begin to comprehend." She took a step closer to Naomi, her gaze unwavering. But Naomi wasn't backing down. She could feel the adrenaline rushing through her veins. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to let them intimidate her now. Suddenly, the plane lurched again, the lights flickering briefly as a deep, mechanical hum filled the cabin. It was subtle at first, but Naomi could feel it. A shift, a sense of urgency growing. Something was happening, and it was happening now. She didn't know what it was, but she knew it wasn't good. The flight attendant, who had been silent for a moment, now took a step forward. "This is your last chance," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Stay out of this, or you'll regret it." Naomi's pulse quickened, but she didn't move. "I'm not afraid of you." The man and the woman exchanged a look. It was subtle, but Naomi caught it. A shift, an agreement. Then, in an instant, everything changed. A loud bang echoed through the cabin, and the lights flickered again, this time going out completely. The plane jerked violently, throwing Naomi off balance. She grabbed onto the nearest seat, her heart racing as panic rippled through the cabin. People were screaming now, shouting, calling for help. The flight attendants in the front began rushing toward the cockpit, their faces hard with determination. Naomi's heart was in her throat. The situation was spiraling out of control faster than she could process. She turned toward the rear of the plane, her eyes searching for any sign of the flight attendants or the two strangers. It was then that she realized the doors to the cockpit were open. Her blood ran cold. The cockpit doors were wide open, and the pilot was nowhere in sight. The plane jolted again, sending Naomi stumbling down the aisle, her mind reeling. The passengers were in a frenzy now, with no clear leadership. Everything had gone from unsettling to downright terrifying. Naomi didn't know what was happening, but she knew it wasn't just an ordinary hijacking. This was something more, and she was trapped in the middle of it. Just then, she heard the unmistakable sound of a voice over the intercom, the captain's voice, but it wasn't the one she had heard earlier. The voice was distorted, cold, almost robotic. "Ladies and gentlemen," the voice crackled, "this plane has been taken. Your cooperation is required if you want to see another sunrise." Naomi's blood ran cold. The stakes had just escalated in a way she could never have imagined. The plot was darker than she thought, and her fight for survival had just begun. The eerie, distorted voice continued through the intercom, sending a chill down Naomi's spine. "Cooperate, and we'll get you all to safety," the voice repeated. It was a cold, almost methodical tone that made Naomi's blood run cold. Whatever was happening, it was far worse than she had imagined. This wasn't just some isolated incident with a rogue flight attendant. It was a hijacking, an organized attack on the plane, and she had no idea who was behind it or what they wanted. The cabin had descended into chaos. Passengers were shouting in panic, some crying, others trying to find any way to communicate with the crew. Naomi's mind was racing as she tried to process the information. The flight attendants were clearly not in control anymore, and whoever had taken over the cockpit had a plan, one that was unfolding rapidly and without mercy. Naomi could feel her own pulse quicken, but she couldn't allow herself to lose focus. She had to think clearly if she wanted to survive. As she moved toward the front of the plane, she saw the two strangers, the man and woman, heading toward the cockpit, their faces grim with determination. The flight attendants who had been with them before had vanished, leaving a palpable silence in their wake. Naomi knew they were heading into dangerous territory, and if she didn't act fast, she might not make it out of this situation alive. Without thinking, Naomi rushed toward the rear of the plane, where she had seen the burner phone earlier. If there was any chance to communicate with someone on the ground, it would be through that phone. Her eyes darted to the back of the cabin, and she saw it. The burner phone was lying on a seat, just as she had last seen it. She grabbed it, her heart pounding in her chest. It was old, untraceable, but it might be her only shot at reaching out for help. Her fingers flew over the keys, trying to dial a number, any number that might connect her to someone who could help. But the moment she hit send, the phone buzzed violently in her hand. Someone was tracking it. Naomi's breath caught in her throat as the cabin suddenly darkened, the lights flickering again, this time with a more urgent rhythm. It wasn't just the phone they were tracking, it was her. She had been marked. The reality of the situation hit her hard. They knew she had the phone. They knew she was trying to fight back. She turned quickly, spotting the man and woman from earlier, now standing at the front of the plane, blocking the aisle. Their cold eyes met hers, and for a moment, there was a silent understanding. She was a threat to their plan, and they wouldn't hesitate to remove her if it meant securing their goal. Naomi felt the weight of that knowledge settle heavily on her shoulders. With no time to waste, Naomi made a split-second decision. She wasn't going to let them take control of her life, not after everything she had been through. Her eyes darted around the cabin as she searched for an exit strategy. She couldn't overpower them physically, but she could outsmart them. In the corner of her eye, Naomi saw a young woman huddling with her child, looking terrified. Naomi's instincts kicked in. She couldn't just save herself, she had to help others too. She motioned to the woman and nodded toward the back of the plane, signaling her to stay low and stay calm. Naomi's plan was simple. She had to draw their attention away from the passengers long enough to disable their communication systems and take back control of the plane. With a deep breath, Naomi sprinted toward the galley, keeping her movements low and fast. The two strangers followed her, their footsteps echoing as they closed the distance. Naomi could feel the sweat on her brow, her heart hammering in her chest, but she pushed forward. The galley was empty, a perfect place for her to make a move. She grabbed a metal tray from a nearby cart, hefting it in her hands, and waited. The footsteps grew louder, but Naomi was ready. As soon as they entered the galley, she swung the tray with all her strength, hitting the man squarely in the chest. He staggered back, surprised but still determined. Naomi didn't hesitate. She launched herself at him, knocking him off balance. He stumbled, falling into a row of seats, and the woman shrieked in surprise. In that moment of chaos, Naomi had one shot to make a move. She lunged for the cockpit door, throwing her body against it with all the force she could muster. The door slammed open, and Naomi fell into the cockpit. She blinked, disoriented, before her eyes locked onto the pilot's seat. It was empty. Her stomach dropped. The realization hit her hard. This was no ordinary hijacking. The pilot had been taken out of commission before the attack even started. Desperation filled her veins. Naomi had to act fast. Her eyes scanned the cockpit, searching for any sign of a solution. The flight controls, the communication systems, everything was in disarray. She needed to stabilize the plane. She didn't know how, but she couldn't just sit there and let it crash. As she fumbled with the controls, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "You're too late," came the cold, familiar voice of the flight attendant who had been part of the plot from the beginning. Naomi spun around, her heart leaping into her throat as the woman stood in the doorway of the cockpit, her expression unreadable. But before Naomi could react, the woman's face softened, and she lowered her weapon. Naomi froze, confused. "What?" "I'm not here to hurt you," the woman said, her voice surprisingly calm. "I'm here to help you." Naomi's mind was reeling. "Help me? After everything, after what you've done?" The woman sighed, her eyes flicking to the controls. This isn't about you. You've been a pawn in a much bigger game. The plane was never the target, you were. Naomi shook her head, unable to make sense of the cryptic statement. What are you talking about? Who are you? The woman hesitated before answering. I work for an organization that wants to keep the world balanced. People like you, people who have the power to make waves, threaten that balance. It's not personal, but it's necessary. Before Naomi could process the weight of the words, the door to the cockpit slammed shut. The last thing she heard was the woman's voice, barely above a whisper. It's over. The plane continued its journey, but Naomi felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. She had survived. She'd have fought back, and for the first time, she understood the stakes. She wasn't just a passenger on that plane. She was part of something bigger, something much darker. The story didn't end here. It was only the beginning. Naomi leaned back in the cockpit chair, her hands still gripping the controls, ready for whatever came next. The plane was hers now, and she wouldn't let anyone take that from her.